So we had just elected Jefferson last time. Now we have to get him in office and see what he's going to do. So Jefferson is actually the first president to take office in Washington, D.C. Took office in March of 1801, but his D.C. Looked nothing like the Washington, D.C. that we know today. What he saw was really not very impressive. Like, the streets weren't paved. Most of the public buildings weren't even finished yet. Like the big Washington Mall with all of the museums, that didn't exist. And the majority of residents in Washington, D.C. were either slaves or low-wage laborers trying to build, the different buildings. And at one point, the roof of the Capitol building collapsed and almost killed the vice president, which actually could have saved us some trouble. But Jefferson's inaugural speech was this attempt to mend fences because the election had been so nasty and contentious. He said, all Americans are Democratic Republicans, all Americans are Federalists, we're all Americans together, kumbaya. He talked about his policy goals. He wants small federal government. He wants free trade. He wants freedom of religion, freedom of the press, friendship to all nations, but not getting dragged into their disputes anymore. Now, Jefferson wanted to get rid of as much of the federal system as he could. And so during his 2 terms of office, he did cut the number of government employees. He started out in his first term slashing the military, particularly the Navy budget. He got Congress to abolish all taxes except for the tariff, and they managed to pay off a good chunk of the national debt. But it wasn't possible to get rid of national power altogether. Jefferson really didn't trust the idea of unelected judges. In particular, he always supported local government over the feds. But Jefferson has to deal with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who has very different ideas. John Marshall had been appointed Chief Justice right before Adams left office. John Marshall is a Federalist. He had been Adams' Secretary of State, got appointed to the court right before Adams left office. Marshall disagrees with Jefferson on almost every question related to the power of the government. Marshall also wants the Supreme Court to mean something, to have more power than the Constitution explicitly gives it. Now remember, Jefferson is a strict constructionist, right? He says that the different branches of the government can only do what the Constitution explicitly gives them the power to do. But now he's got this Chief Justice that he's got to deal with who has very different ideas. Now, the first landmark decision of the Marshall Court, and really the foundation for almost every major Supreme Court decision since then, was the case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803. Okay, here's the background to it. The very first Congress that sat back in 1789, they had passed a law called the Judiciary Act. The Judiciary Act said officials of the executive branch, of the president's branch, have to deliver the commission to the judges that the president appoints. So the president appoints Supreme Court justices, circuit court justices, Federal Court of Appeals judges. The president appoints all of that. And the Judiciary Act says, since the president appoints them, it is the responsibility of his branch of government, of the executive branch, to actually deliver the commissions, the paperwork that says you get to have this job. And if the executive branch does not deliver that paperwork to the appointed justice, that justice can't actually take his seat. Well, fast forward to 1800. Shortly before he left office, John Adams had appointed several justices of the peace, all of them Federalists. But he did it so close to when he left office that he wasn't able to get all of the commissions delivered into their hands before Jefferson comes in and takes over. There are literally a stack of commissions on the presidential desk in Washington, D.C. when Jefferson walks in. So under the Judiciary Act, Jefferson ought to order members of his executive branch, usually his Secretary of State, James Madison, ought to order his employees to deliver these commissions. These justices of the peace were legally appointed by a sitting president. And now that Jefferson is the president, he ought to, under the law, go ahead and deliver those commissions. He doesn't want to, though, because they're all Federalists, and he's a Democratic Republican, and he doesn't want these guys to be justices of the peace. So he tells his Secretary of State, James Madison, to not deliver these commissions. Well, 4 of the justices sued because they were supposed to have these jobs. And now they can't get them because they don't have the paperwork. And William Marbury is one of these justices. And he gives his name to the entire case of Marbury v. Madison. Well, they try this thing, then they appeal it, then the other side appeals it, gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And this question poses a real problem for the court, and in particular for Chief Justice Marshall. He's got a choice here. The court can decide that yes, Madison must deliver these commissions. That is what the law says. But if they tell Madison to deliver the commissions, what if Madison says no? Like, the Supreme Court doesn't actually have any enforcement power. They can hand down their decisions, but if everybody else just goes, whatever, they can't do anything about it. Marshall doesn't want to look weak. But Marshall also doesn't want to give in to Jefferson, because Marshall's a Federalist, Jefferson's a Democratic Republican. They really don't like each other. So Marshall came up with this ingenious little idea. Marshall said that under the law, under the Judiciary Act, Marbury had a legal right to his commission, because he had been legally and constitutionally appointed by a sitting president. However, Marshall said that he was not going to order Madison to deliver that commission because the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. Marshall and the majority of the court agreed that Congress should not have had the power to order an executive office, in this case the Secretary of State, to deliver a commission. This is the first time that the Supreme Court says that a law is unconstitutional. Jefferson does not know how to react. He's gotten his way on the question of whether or not these commissions will be delivered. No, they will not be delivered. So he's happy about that. Yay, the Federalists don't get those positions. Yay, he can appoint his own guys. But the cost was high, because now the court is saying that they have the power. It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. This is called judicial review. Almost all of the cases that the Supreme Court hears now is based on the principle of judicial review. But judicial review isn't in the Constitution. Jefferson is infuriated that these unelected judges have claimed the right to decide the constitutionality of a law, because that's not a power that the Constitution gave to them. That gives these judges that we don't elect, an enormous amount of power, which they still have. And so Jefferson is not really that pleased by this decision. I think he would almost have rather just let Marbury have the damn job. Now, the biggest irony of Jefferson's presidency involves both his greatest achievement and also his own massive violation of the Constitution. This is the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase really happened because of the Haitian Revolution. We talked about that before. The slaves of Haiti defeated their owners, the militia, some of Napoleon's troops. And Napoleon, who is in charge of France at this point, the Emperor of France, he has spent so much money unsuccessfully trying to put down this slave rebellion in Haiti that he needs cash fast. And since he has lost Haiti, which was the jewel in the French crown, their most lucrative colony, he decides that he's not really that interested in American colonies at all anymore. So when Jefferson comes knocking, Napoleon is willing to grant more than Jefferson asked for. Now, the Louisiana Territory stretched from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Mississippi River over to the Rocky Mountains, and in particular, it contained the port city of New Orleans. And at first, that was all that Jefferson wanted. The right to trade through New Orleans was essential to American farmers in the Western territories. You know, if you're on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, it's so much easier to get your goods down the Mississippi River than it is to haul it east over the mountains toward New York or Charleston. With Napoleon in power, Jefferson is worried that America might lose access to New Orleans, or that he might jack up the cost and make it too expensive to use the port there. And so Jefferson offered to buy the city of New Orleans from France. And when he did, Napoleon said, you know what, just take the whole frickin' thing. Take the entire Louisiana Territory. I don't even care anymore. You're not going to have to pay me that much. Give me like 15 million bucks for it. Even in today's money, that is a steal. So Jefferson signed the agreement and doubled the size of the United States. But it's a problem for him. The Constitution does not explicitly give the president the power to buy land. It especially does not say that he can buy land without congressional approval. Land purchases are supposed to go through Congress. Jefferson has been saying since the beginning that you can only do what the Constitution specifically says you can do, and then here he goes, buying all this land. Jefferson believed that the benefits justified his constitutional violation. He believed that this land would allow the United States to remain a farming country. He intended to use the Louisiana Purchase as a reserve for all the native people who are still living east of the Mississippi River. Force them west, force them into a designated Indian territory, and then white Americans would be able to spread out. It would make, he thought, more land available for poor men and for younger sons, and he believed that he was ensuring the economic future of the United States. Within a year of the purchase, Jefferson sent an expedition out to explore the new territory. This is the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, Lewis and Clark have a scientific goal, and they have an economic goal. For science, they're supposed to study the plants and the animals. They discovered mammoth bones and sent some of them back to Jefferson. They didn't really know, it wasn't a complete skeleton, so they weren't really sure what kind of creature this was. And so Jefferson, for the rest of his presidency, will keep sending people out west to try and find the living animal that had those gigantic freaking bones. And of course, they never actually found them. Now, for trade, Lewis and Clark are supposed to set up trading networks, economic networks, with the tribes in the West. And if possible, he said they should find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Well, that doesn't exist in the Louisiana Territory. Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis in the spring of 1804 with fewer than 50 men. They made it to North Dakota just in time for the winter to set in. And I've got to tell you, winter in North Dakota did not impress Lewis and Clark at all. But they met someone very important when they were in North Dakota. When they set out again the next spring, they were guided by a 15-year-old Shoshone girl, who we call Sacagawea. She acted as their kind of ambassador and their interpreter. She didn't speak English, but she was married to a French fur trader, and she could speak French to him, and he could speak a little bit of English to Lewis and Clark. And then Sacagawea could speak Shoshone, she could speak Hidatsa and Arikara and Atsena, a whole bunch of different native languages. So Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea and her husband kind of play a game of telephone as they move west across the continent. Lewis and Clark will ask a question in English. Her husband will try to understand what it is they're asking and then say it to her in French. And then she would pass it on in whatever language she and the tribe they were talking to collectively communicate in. Most of the time it worked out okay, but there were absolutely a couple of times when what Lewis and Clark thought they were saying is not what ended up being interpreted at the other end, and there were a couple of little kerfuffles over misinterpretation there. On one occasion, they had to run away really fast. But together, they reached the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805. They brought back a huge amount of information and specimens of animals and plants. They never found a water route, but they did prove that it was possible to reach the Pacific overland. Now, the only part of the Louisiana Purchase with a significant non-native population was the region around New Orleans. Now, when the U.S. took control, the city of New Orleans had a population of about 8,000 people, and more than half of them were of African descent. About 3,000 of them were slaves, but 1,300 to 1,500-ish were free. The U.S. wasn't really sure how to incorporate New Orleans into the United States. French law had allowed free black people to have nearly all the rights of white citizens. Even slaves under the French government had legal protections that were unheard of in the U.S. Spain, which periodically conquered and took over New Orleans, when Spain was in charge, they had made it very easy for slaves in New Orleans to buy their freedom, to be voluntarily freed by their owners. Slaves even had the right to sue their owners in court. Now, the treaty that transferred the Louisiana Territory to the United States promised that all free peoples would have the full rights of citizens, but that promise wasn't honored. Under the French and even under the Spanish, women had been co-owners of family property. American law would only recognize that within the city of New Orleans. In the surrounding plantations, that's a no-go. Free black people suffered a really drastic decline in status. The new local legislature soon adopted one of the most sweeping slave codes in U.S. history. This new law said that freedmen were forbidden to ever consider themselves the equal of whites. Now, the United States has had laws regarding what slaves and what free people of color were allowed to do, what actions they were allowed to take. Those laws have been in place since before the United States existed as an independent nation, but we'd never before had a law telling free people what to think, and certainly not what to think of themselves. This is something entirely new. Most of the pathways out of slavery were closed off. Slaves could no longer sue in court. Louisiana's slaves had actually had much more freedom under the French monarchy than they did under U.S. democracy. Now, among other things, the Louisiana Purchase showed that the U.S. was deeply affected by events in the rest of the world. We would never have gotten the Louisiana Territory if France hadn't been in a tizzy about Haiti. You know, this is a time when Americans still rely on British markets to sell their farm produce, when we rely on British suppliers for most of our manufactured goods. And so European wars directly affect the livelihood of American farmers and American merchants and American craftsmen. Jefferson wants to avoid foreign entanglements, but that was impossible. And even though Jefferson wanted to limit the size and the scope of the national government, problems in foreign relations made him expand it. Just a few months after he took office, Jefferson had to start rebuilding the Navy that he had tried to gut. The Barbary states were causing problems. The Barbary states are these city-states, Algiers and Tunis, Tripoli, on the coast of North Africa. They are officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality, they're mostly controlled by merchant princes and traders, and they get most of their goods by piracy. They would attack ships sailing in the Mediterranean and in the near Atlantic and seize the goods and then sell them off. And then they started demanding essentially protection bribes from several countries. If you don't want us to attack your ships, pay us this money and we'll leave them alone for this year. They demanded those protection bribes of the United States, and we had always paid them before. Washington paid, Adams paid, Jefferson paid when he first took office. But in 1801, they demanded a second payment, and Jefferson refused. If we had had the money, he might have paid it, but we really didn't have the money. The Pasha of Tripoli declared war on the United States. That conflict lasted, the First Barbary War lasted, until the U.S. Navy won the Battle of Tripoli in 1804. And if you're a Marine, or if you know anybody in the Marine Corps, the Marine Corps hymn references this. It says, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." The halls of Montezuma is a reference to the Mexican War, which we'll talk about later. The shores of Tripoli is this pirates' war. The conflict between Britain and France was much more serious. We're still trying to be neutral. According to international law, neutral nations have the right to trade non-military goods with countries at war. But by 1806, France had blockaded British ports. Britain was blockading French ports. Both of them were stopping U.S. ships from trading. And the British also started kidnapping and impressing our sailors again. Within a year, the British had kidnapped more than 6,000 American sailors, including some men that they had stolen off of an American warship in U.S. waters, right off the coast of Maryland. Well, to Jefferson, this is not tenable. The U.S. economy needs to be able to trade. American farmers need access to the markets in Europe and in the Caribbean. We would also very much like to not have our soldiers and our sailors kidnapped anymore. So Jefferson decides to use trade as a weapon. He asked Congress to pass an embargo. An embargo, in this case, is a ban on all American trading vessels sailing for any foreign port. For someone who says he believes in small government, this is an amazing exercise in federal power. Jefferson hoped that the embargo would stop the impressment problem, because the Brits can't kidnap sailors they can't catch. And he also hoped that without our stuff, without access to our markets, and without our farm products, he hoped that Britain and France would realize that they needed us, and that they would agree to let us trade freely. In 1808, U.S. exports dropped by 80%. Now, you might expect it to drop by closer to 100%, since we weren't supposed to have trading vessels sailing for any foreign port at all. Not even Russian ports, or Italian ports, Canadian ports. It didn't fall by 100% because the U.S. has a long and glorious history of smuggling. But it seems that France and England didn't really notice. U.S. farmers and merchants were hurting desperately, but those other countries didn't seem to feel any kind of a pinch at all. The embargo devastated American port cities, but it didn't solve the problem. Just before Jefferson left office, he signed a new law. This was called the Non-Intercourse Act. This forbade trade with France and Britain, but it did allow trade with the rest of the world, so we can start legally sailing again. The Non-Intercourse Act also said that if France and Britain would agree to play fair, then we would trade with them once again. As soon as they notice that they're missing us. Jefferson left office at the lowest point in his career. 4 years earlier, he had been riding high. He had won a sweeping re-election. He'd even won some old Federalist strongholds. But that embargo was a failure. It was a hurt for Americans. Shippers increasingly violated it, and then they violated the Non-Intercourse Act as well. Jefferson's successor was James Madison. Madison said that he would gladly trade with anyone, but if France will step up and play nice with us, then not only will we trade with them, we will embargo Britain. And Britain controlled the seas anyway, so France said, okay, fine, we'll support your neutral shipping rights. The British kept attacking and kidnapping, and so Madison imposed the embargo just on Britain. Meanwhile, there's a group of younger congressmen, mostly from the West, from the frontier, who are calling for war with Britain. This new generation of politicians called themselves the war hawks. They had come of age after the Revolution, and they were eager to prove that the U.S. was just as strong, just as powerful as any other nation was. They were led by Henry Clay. He was the Speaker of the House. He's from Kentucky. And John Calhoun, who's a senator from sort of frontier Carolina, South Carolina. The war hawks spoke passionately about defending our national honor, but they did have some practical goals. First of all, they want more land. They want Florida, which is still controlled by Spain. We don't actually have any beef with Spain right now, but they want Florida. And they want Canada. They want to essentially force every other country off of this continent. They want all of North America to be controlled by the United States. They also talked about free trade. They talked about getting out from under all of these foreign problems. And the growing crisis between the U.S. and Britain took place against a backdrop of really lousy Indian relations in the West. When the War of 1812 starts, it won't just be the U.S. and Britain. It will also affect Native people. Jefferson, for a long time, had been in favor of removing Indians to west of the Mississippi River. The Louisiana Purchase made that seem like a good option to him. Jefferson, as president, had worked really hard to get a hold of Indian land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. He had encouraged American merchants to lend money to the tribes so that they could then be forced to sell their land to pay off that debt. On the other hand, the government, since Washington, had also tried to promote settled private land-owning farming among the tribes. One of Jefferson's agents in the Ohio Territory also tried to promote slavery among the nations. He told them that owning African slaves would be a way of civilizing them. Privately, he also thought that that would be a way to make those tribes dependent on the United States. By 1800, by the time Jefferson's running for election, there are nearly 400,000 white Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains. They far outnumbered the native people who remained there, and it was causing a crisis among those nations. Some Indian leaders, particularly among the Cherokee and the Creek and the Choctaw, they begin to support assimilation, adopting white culture, white land ownership, white gender roles. Major Ridge and John Ross were the Cherokee leaders who most strongly pushed for this. Many of their supporters were businessmen and traders and slave-owning farmers, and most of them were of mixed blood. Indian men who had white fathers had an easier chance to build businesses and get their land claims recognized by the U.S. government. But that push for assimilation infuriated the nativists, the ones who want to root out European influences and resist all of these demands that they change who they are. The period from 1800 to about 1812 is sometimes called an age of prophecy among the Indians. There were movements to rebuild traditional life that grew among the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Shawnee, and others. Handsome Lake was a Seneca preacher. He urged his nation to become spiritually pure, to avoid fighting and gambling and drinking and promiscuity, and he believed that that purification would help his people get their sovereignty back. But by this point, the Seneca are fairly small. The Iroquois Confederacy has not rebuilt since the Revolution, so he doesn't feel like his people can directly challenge the U.S. government. And so Handsome Lake does allow for quite a bit of assimilation to happen. He urged the Seneca to take up European-style farming, send their children to white-run schools, adopt European gender roles. The Shawnee, though, are much more militant. There's a young Shawnee leader, not officially a war chief, but a warrior of great respect, named Tecumseh. His brother, Tenskwatawa, is a religious prophet. Tenskwatawa called for a complete separation of native people from white people. He wanted to revive the old traditions and resist the U.S. government. Tenskwatawa preached that white people were the source of evil, and that Indians should abandon white alcohol and European clothing and food and manufactured goods, and he started gathering religious followers at a place called Tippecanoe, which is today in Indiana. While Tenskwatawa is preaching, Tecumseh starts traveling all through the Ohio and the Mississippi valleys, trying to gather a military alliance. He said, if the nations don't band together and resist, they will be destroyed. He asked, where today are the Pequot? Where are the Narragansett, the Mohica, the Poconet, and the other powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man as snow before the summer sun. Tecumseh said that Indians must think of themselves as a single people, or at least a people with a single purpose. He said they must unite. He renounced the chiefs who had sold land to the U.S. government. He renounced the chiefs that said, a little assimilation is fine. He got support from many traditionalist Chickamauga Cherokee, Fox, Miami, Mingo, Ottawa, Delaware, Wyandot, a whole lot of people that live around here today. He got 3,000 warriors to gather at Tippecanoe, where his brother was building this religious movement. And then Tecumseh started training them, organizing them into units, and calling for attacks on white frontier settlements. They had a brief setback. Tecumseh went off trying to recruit some more troops. Tenskwatawa decided that he was going to try his own military strength, which he did not have. So he tried to launch a surprise attack on the governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, and Harrison ended up burning Tippecanoe to the ground. Many U.S. newspapers started to report that the British were involved in this. They said that the British were encouraging Tecumseh, that they were supplying him with weapons, that they were giving him all these ideas. And the truth is, the British government in Canada had tried to make an alliance with Tecumseh, but he had refused up to this point. Anger at this alleged British conspiracy pushed white Americans closer to war. In June of 1812, boy, that map is too blurry to be useful. Let's just move on. In June of 1812, President Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war. He asked because of the continued attacks on American shipping and on this so-called British Indian conspiracy. Madison said that if the U.S. didn't fight, we would never truly be independent. He said that only fighting will push the British off our backs. The result of the war vote revealed a deeply divided nation. Congressmen from the South and the West voted for war. Northern congressmen voted against it. Northern congressmen tend to be backed by merchants. Merchants feel like the trade has already been disrupted more than we can handle. They don't want it disrupted by war. Southerners and Westerners tended to not like the British anyway, and they were extremely upset by these rumors that the British are inciting Tecumseh. And they also want more land. Now, from our perspective, it seems a little foolhardy for a disunited, small, very young, extremely unprepared, and super broke nation to go to war with one of the world's major powers. You know, we were barely able to pay for the dang thing. The charter of the First Bank of the United States had expired a year before we declared war. So we don't have them to make loans and to handle the financial situation. And Northern merchants and bankers are not going to do it because they don't want this war in the first place. Before the war ended, the U.S. is once again nearly bankrupt. Really, the only thing that saved us is that for most of our war, Britain ignored us. I mean, they're still fighting with France. They have been fighting with France since 1793. They're still there. But as long as Britain is concentrating on Europe, they're not turning their full force against the United States. Now, the U.S. will try to take advantage of that. We will attempt to invade Canada. Canadian troops will pretty easily repel U.S. forces. And in 1814, once Britain had dealt with Napoleon, then they had the time to focus on the United States. Britain invaded the U.S., they seized Washington, D.C., they burned the White House to the ground while the government fled for safety. Now, Americans had some military success, especially on the seas, which was surprising because Britain had the world's largest and most powerful navy. We won the Battle of Lake Erie. That was pretty cool. There were 15 big warships fighting on one of the Great Lakes. We also won the Battle of Fort McHenry. That was another semi-naval battle. Go back here. Fort McHenry stood at the entrance to the Baltimore harbor, and so it's the only thing blocking British ships from taking the city of Baltimore, and the U.S. won that. And watching that battle inspired Francis Scott Key to compose the Star-Spangled Banner, which in the 1930s will become the national anthem. There were also some significant victories over Western Indian tribes. Now, Tecumseh for several years had refused an alliance with the British. He didn't think they were any better than the U.S. was. But eventually, since he's going to get blamed for having an alliance anyway, he might as well get some advantage from it. So he accepted a commission from the British government, and along with that some weapons and some supplemental troops. And he started out doing very, very well. The first British commander that was sort of loaned to Tecumseh trusted him implicitly. Whatever Tecumseh wanted to do, this British commander, this colonel, was enthusiastically willing to do. Tecumseh came up with this wonderful plan. Near Fort Detroit, there was an American commander who was absolutely frickin' terrified of Indians. Had been raised on stories of, frontier brutality and all of this stuff, and Tecumseh knew it. He didn't have very many men right there near Fort Detroit, so what he did was he found this open space, this clearing, that was mostly surrounded by brush on the other sides, on either side of it. So he took his smallish number of men, and he had them march through this clearing over and over again, and then circle back around, and then march through again, and then again. And so the American troops inside Fort Detroit are looking and trying to count, and they're coming up with, they think Tecumseh has like 3,000 dudes out there, and he's really got fewer than 500. So the American commander just surrenders, just like gives up, because he doesn't want to go to battle. Unfortunately, the British colonel who was originally assigned to work with Tecumseh dies in battle. A new person is assigned, and this dude doesn't want to work with Tecumseh at all. He doesn't want to be there. He doesn't trust anything that Tecumseh wants to do, doesn't trust him to make the right decisions, doesn't even really want to be fighting with the United States, even though there is a declared war in place. So this dude won't back him up. And Tecumseh ends up being killed at a battle that the British troops were supposed to send reinforcements to, and did not. Well, in March of 1814, an army of white Americans and pro-assimilation Cherokee, under the command of Colonel Andrew Jackson, defeat some Creek people, the Red Stick Creek, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. Jackson forced the Creek to cede more than half of their land to the federal government, and then he'll spend the rest of his life trying to push Native people further west. Eventually, Jackson will betray even those Cherokee who had fought alongside him. But before he did that, Jackson led troops to the greatest U.S. victory of the war, the Battle of New Orleans. Now, Jackson he's a slave owner, but he recruited free black men from the New Orleans region into his forces, and he promised them the same pay and the same land bounties as he gave to white soldiers. And so he gathered up quite a large number of men to face off against the British when they landed. And Jackson's men just absolutely smashed the tail off the British. Unfortunately, this great victory was not helpful in the peace talks, because the Battle of New Orleans actually took place after the war was over and the treaty was already signed. It's what happens when you don't have email, right? The Treaty of Ghent had been signed in December of 1814. The news didn't reach the U.S. until after the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. And neither the U.S. nor the British wanted to continue the war. Really, neither of us is making much headway in terms of territory against each other. So the treaty that ended this war essentially restored the status quo. It basically put things back the way they were. No territory exchange between the British and the U.S. took place. And the British still wouldn't promise to stop kidnapping Americans, still wouldn't promise to respect neutral shipping rights. Yeah, but considering that the war hadn't really been a blazing military success for us, maybe that's about as good an outcome as we could expect. So why are we talking about a war where we didn't gain any territory from the British? I mean, we don't actually talk about every little thing that happened in this class, so why this? Well, just because no territory came to the U.S. from Britain doesn't mean that the war was pointless. At the time, a lot of Americans called the War of 1812 the Second War of Independence. Before this war, the U.S. was genuinely on shaky ground. You know, there's no guarantee that we would survive the war. We hadn't had to fight a war under a constitutional form of government ever before. This is the first one. But this war proved that a democratic Republican government can carry out a war without losing all of its democratic institutions. When the U.S. did win the rare battle, they said that it proved the righteousness of the United States and the righteousness of its cause, and proved that free citizens can defeat the forces of monarchy. And the war did get the U.S. some territory, particularly from Indian nations in the Old Northwest and a significant part of the South as well. That altogether makes the War of 1812 important for the United States. Britain did not retake the U.S. Our country and our form of government held strong. In Britain, they don't really talk about this. Like the War of 1812 just sort of blends in with the whole Napoleonic Wars thing. They don't really care. But when the Napoleonic Wars are over, when Napoleon is defeated, Europe, Western Europe at least, was essentially at peace for a good long time. And Europe being at peace, for the first time since 1793, means that the U.S. isn't being bothered with their problems. We don't have various navies attacking our ships anymore. And so now that we can trade, now that we have no real reason to get up a military stance, the U.S. can kind of go back to minding its business, withdraw from global affairs. America developed a real sense of separateness from the old world in the aftermath of this war. Now, the War of 1812 strengthened Canadian nationalism, though, which is based in part on being separate from the United States. Canadians did not rise up to join the U.S., just like they hadn't joined us during the Revolution. And when Canadian forces pushed back that attempted invasion, that was a real shot of pride for them. And so Canadians tend to consider the War of 1812 a tremendous victory and a really important moment in Canadian nationhood, Canadian identity. They also have a song about burning down the White House. Now, the War of 1812 had an effect on American politics. It essentially killed off the Federalist Party. You know, the Federalists had been the anti-war faction of the government. And in December of 1814, there had been a gathering of Federalists up at Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss all of their grievances and gripe about and tear down President Madison, and he's so terrible. And they demanded constitutional changes to make sure that we never again have another Virginia president, because they drag us into war and they do horrible things and we don't want them. Now, if the war had dragged on, that might have worked. The Federalists might have gotten some support for that. But while they were at this Hartford Convention, news about the victory in New Orleans broke. Then we got news about the peace treaty, and the country was just ecstatic. They love General Jackson, they love President Madison, and all of this talk about changing the Constitution so we never have another President Madison again. Well, that seemed poorly thought out at best. At worst, some people thought it was treasonous, and the Federalist Party fell apart fast. Within a few years, it just didn't exist at all. The country that the Federalists had wanted to create, a country with industry, with manufacturing, that country is starting to grow. but without any Federalists to support it. Instead, that kind of economic system will develop under the control of a party that really doesn't like that economic system. And we'll talk about how very weird that gets when we go to the next lecture.